And now it's time for the sponsor perspective portion of our program. Before we get going, a quick clarification. While I'm conducting this next interview and the questions are mine, the content of the portion of today's program shouldn't be considered editorial. With that, I'm pleased to welcome Brendan O'Grady, President and CEO of Teva Pharmaceuticals USA. Brendan, you and I have discussed the issue, the trauma America went through as COVID-19 hit, the stress that put on PPE, on pharmaceuticals around the world. And I'd just love to understand that from your perspective, what was America exposed to from the COVID-19 crisis that we should be worried about?
Well, I think that what became apparent during the COVID-19 crisis, especially the early days of the COVID-19 crisis, was the reliance on foreign manufacturing for our pharmaceuticals, many of our pharmaceuticals, especially generics, a lot of the active pharmaceutical ingredients, which we call API, certainly the starter chemicals, and also the personal protection equipment. In the early days, I don't think that was really something that most people thought about, and then all of a sudden we started to see supply disruptions as a result.
Well, I think when you saw that, you saw basically the seizing up of concern. It wasn't just in the United States, it was really globally. Now, Teva is the largest generic manufacturer in the world. Did you see the similar patterns in all of the places you operate, or did anybody get it, really better than we did?
Well, I would say some places got it better than others, but I think that, again, in the early days, nobody was really quite sure what the extent of the COVID-19 pandemic would look like. Nobody was really sure of the lethality of the disease. And so I think it was a lot of just reacting in real time. And of course, there was this kind of mentality around hoarding and trying to protect oneself or one's own country. And so we did see supply disruptions as a result, as countries shut down borders, not just for pharmaceuticals, but personal protection equipment and other necessary items as they figured out how to deal with the pandemic. I think the United States did a very good job at dealing with it. The crisis averted over time. But even today, we still have shortages of some critical medicines that is continuing to be a result of the pandemic.
Now, as a result of other discussions I've had with you and members of Congress, other pharmaceutical leaders out there, I've always found it fascinating that members of Congress did not know that active pharmaceutical ingredients, that very few of these, if any, were really produced in the United States, and that there's this dependency on the globe, just the way things have become. What is the right balance between looking at how you restore trust in a global network and bringing some of that productive capacity back in the United States? How do you get the equities there right so that trust is restored and we don't, but yet we're still global?
It's a great question, and it's really at the crux of the matter. I'm a child of the 70s and the early 80s, and I remember growing up south of Buffalo, New York, and Bethlehem Steel closed down. And steel manufacturing moved offshore. Of course, the clothing industry largely moved offshore, and pharmaceuticals, especially generics, is really no different. I think that in order to maintain a sustainable profit margin, most manufacturers have had to move manufacturing to lowest cost countries. So when you think about how do we secure the national drug supply or the U.S. drug supply, there's really three major things that I think we can do. I think we can reshore or bring some manufacturing back to the U.S., especially those critical medicines that are on the critical medicine list. But to do so, we have to have a sustainable pricing model for those to be profitable. The second thing we can do is we can increase the numbers and the quantities and the strategic national supply, especially for those coming from foreign sources. And I think the third thing that we can do is we can look at manufacturing in allied-friendly countries, such as Canada, Europe, and Israel, and other locations more friendly to the United States, and maybe away from countries that are more adversarial or geopolitically unstable.
So how much of that could be done? And I mean, I hate to get into the details with you, but I know you deal with details, every day. So when you look at that pricing, those pricing models, would really interest me. I mean, that's in part pricing. It's also the marketplace. It's regulation. So this isn't just something you can wave a wand at. You need to have serious planning and strategy for a reshoring campaign, I assume. Has anybody kind of drawn up what that kind of plan might look like?
Well, I think there's people that are looking at it. We're certainly in dialogue with the government about some of these strategies. I mean, if you think about, I'll just take Teva, for example. we make over 600 medicines for the U.S. market, and we make about a third of them here. But the other 2/3 we make in other locations around the world, and we do so because that's the only way that we can make a profit. And I think that most people would probably be shocked to know that if you look at our vast portfolio, about 40% of that portfolio we sell out to wholesalers for about the price of a cup of coffee. And there's this narrative that's out there about how expensive medications are, and I'm not going to debate or deny that there are some medications that are very, very expensive, but overall, 90% of the utilization in the United States is generic drugs, and the vast majority of those generic drugs are very affordable. We had a product that we made in New Jersey, and we made 1 billion doses a year of it. We lost $14 million a year doing that. So we moved it to Eastern Europe to one of our manufacturing plants there. And now we turned that $14 million loss into a $20 million profit. So there's a $34 million swing. Now, to maintain and keep that product here in the U.S. would have been about 25 cents a dose. So something very reasonable. We're not talking lots of a huge expense, but the market just wouldn't support it. So that's why we had to move it to Eastern Europe. So when I talk about sustainable pricing, those are the kind of things that I'm talking about, is getting some kind of a model and working with the government and other policymakers to assure that we can make those critical medicines here and do it at a reasonable profit margin so we can assure not only the security, but also the sustainability.
You've also talked, Brendan, about I think it's called the National Strategic Stockpile, but I might have that wrong. But when you kind of look at it about how it can be smarter, how can we be looking at the sort of top drugs that the nation needs? What kind of steps would you like to see the U.S. government take, and how would you, as a leader in the private sector, look to partner with that?
Well, first, I'd like to, acknowledge that the federal government is looking at this on a daily basis, and it's something that they're very focused on. There's been a couple big deals announced in the press not too long ago, and I think that as we look at this, Teva being one of the largest generics manufacturer in the world and one of the largest pharmaceutical manufacturers, is we have infrastructure and we have the regulatory, the know-how already in place to do this. So I think there's Teva and there's others that could step in and make a pretty big impact immediately, especially with some of the critical medicines. We have several plants here in the United States with varying technologies. We're looking at bringing some of those critical medicines back and are having that dialogue with the federal government. But again, what really this all hinges on is, can we do it? And will we be able to recover our costs and make a reasonable profit in doing so and moving it from another location?
I think sometimes the U.S. public doesn't realize how large a firm you are, that you're, I think, 1 out of 10 every drugs that are out there. I may even be understating that for a moment. But I mean, I think the broad sense is you have a huge footprint in the United States. You also have a huge footprint globally. As you look at kind of the state of global affairs, and I call it sort of the need for high trust networks in a time when trust is stressed out. I'd just love to get your sense, your North Star, if you will, for your company. I know you run Teva USA, but I mean, when you're kind of looking at these networks we need, are you worried down the road about the stress on these networks?
Well, of course, I'm certainly worried, but I think that Teva has done an outstanding job at managing all of it. As you mentioned, I'm president and CEO of Teva USA, but I also have North America as part of my responsibility. So that includes Canada, and I sit on our executive committee. So I am very involved in global decisions and the global nature of our job. Or of our company. As you mentioned, 1 out of every 10 prescriptions in the United States is filled with a Teva product. And just to give you a sense of scale, that's about 370 million prescriptions a year and actually billions of doses. Just in 2018 alone, Teva was responsible for $42 billion in savings to the U.S. healthcare system, and actually $6 billion we put directly back into patients' pockets. So we are a very large player in the healthcare system, and we take that role very seriously, and we're very focused on making sure that we can get medicines, not just critical medicines, but medicines to all of our patients. We can keep our manufacturing going, and we can work through some of these supply challenges.
Brendan, just final question. One of the things that I've been thinking about, and I've enjoyed my conversation with you in the past, is are we prepared for the next time something hits? It's one thing to kind of be dealing with COVID today, but what about the next pandemic that hits? And a lot of people worry about that. Do you think we are incorporating the lessons we're learning from this now in a serious way to be prepared for the next round?
Well, I think as a society, as a government, and certainly Teva as a generic and branded pharmaceutical manufacturer, that we are learning lessons and we are prepared. I think that, as we look at our manufacturing network, certainly there's things that we can do to play a role in the strategic national supply. Certainly there's some products, especially the critical medicines, that we can bring back to the United States. But I think the other key component to Teva and our strategy is that we're somewhat diversified around the world with a lot of manufacturing in Europe, some manufacturing in Israel, and other allied-friendly countries. So in a way, that helps us de-risk a little bit some kind of geopolitical event, a natural disaster or war happening in one location, and having all your manufacturing in that one location. I think the lesson learned would be as an industry, or particularly the governments, is that we have an understanding if something like this, or when something like this happens again, how we want to react and make sure we get medicines to not just Americans, certainly that's important to all of us, but to everybody in the world that needs those medicines, as events unfold.
Well, listen, I just want to say thank you for being as involved and engaged in these important issues. And we talk about them, and sometimes we throw stuff around very carelessly, but I know you're at it all the time, every day. So thank you so much for your time. Brendan O'Grady, President and CEO, Teva Pharmaceuticals USA, thanks so much for your time and for supporting today's program.
Thank you.